also before dinner. The performance of Israel's economy have been positive. And I would like to also ask whether they were sufficiently good based on criteria and parameters that I'm going to define in a moment. And then ultimately, I'm going to talk about the various social and economic challenges that we face. Well, the parameters of Israel's economy are excellent. We have grown in 2017 by 3.4%. It's not a one-off event. You can see that it is a growth process with two sort of irregular moments in 2000 and 2009, and I'll expand on those in a moment. GDP reaches $40,000 per annum, which puts us in a progressive European category. We haven't got an inflation problem, although it is below our target, but that doesn't really worry us. Now, the level of employment is 4.2, and it is slowly but surely decreasing. And in fact, our economy actually has full employment, and that is an improved situation. And also the rate of employment over the last years has actually improved. So many people have actually joined the labor force, but it has actually somewhat been exhausted, and this has ramifications. And I will explain about the productivity in a moment and how this is connected. We have a surplus in our actual balance of payments, and in one of our breaks, I said that had we actually woken Pinchas Sapir from his grave and said we've got $1 billion over, he'd say, no, 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 this is not our economy, and gone back to sleep. We do have that. Some of those are in the reserves of the Bank of Israel. And if we think about our resilience, I think it's a very important component in the national resilience of the State of Israel, knowing that we have those reserves. We have also a surplus of production because of high tech, but not everything is positive. We have a problem of poverty that recently, over the last years, we can see a trend of improvement. The red line shows the poverty before the government intervened, and the yellow line is after its intervention. Now, the question is whether this is sufficient. And as one can see, it isn't sufficient. The poverty is still really at a peak, and if we compare ourselves to the OECD countries, unfortunately, our poverty is really in dire straits. Now, there's inequality in the State of Israel, but it is improving. You can see that there's a trend in a decrease in it. And you can see before the intervention and after the intervention. Now I can understand that professor from the Weizmann Institute, this mouse is not sufficiently good. Now, but you can actually see us in comparison to the OECD. But I'd like you to look at the difference between two periods when we were very vulnerable, when the economy suffered a severe blow. It was the longest recession, and it started at the beginning of the year of the millennium, and a period of resilience wherein the entire GDP going down all over the world, including America, and yet with us it remained stable. So where did this resilience derive from, emanate from? So if we look at this period of vulnerability wherein we sort of shrink and there's no growth, as compared to the relative resilience that we developed in a result of various issues that I will expand on, that was manifest in that horrific economic crisis. It was unprecedented for at least 100 years. Suddenly we saw that we had a positive growth in compared to what was happening around the world. Now, what did this emanate from? This resilience was because we were able to withstand the real tremors, security tremors. Had we not known that in 2006 that there would have been the Second Lebanon War, then the economic data wouldn't have shown us this at all. It continued growing very nicely, a nice rate, and even during the campaigns in the Gaza Strip, the government of Israel was able to actually withstand these tremors, these earthquakes. I'm not sure, if it's one like Amos spoke about, but at least those that we have experienced, at least in the last decade, we did withstand it. Now, what are the sources of this resilience? The roots of it? First of all, an opening shot that was very positive during the time in 2007 when there was an outbreak of that crisis. We had a very sort of a conservative fiscal rule, the government budget that was actually balanced, very low deficit, and we can see the actual balance of debt and product, an anti-inflational policy. You can see the balance of payments, and a financial sector, the banking sector, that was stable as a result of various things that happened before. So all this assisted us overcoming that financial crisis in the best possible way. But these continued in the last decade as well. In other words, the fiscal policy, that of the government. Have a look at the deficit of the government. It's a very low deficit, which enables us to continue decreasing our internal debt, the public debt, if you compare it to product. And I think Israel is the only country out of the European bloc that actually does fulfill the Maastricht Charter. And we reach a level that was really very conservative and desirable. So our monetary policy is also excellent. The policy of interest, which is very flexible. We can actually lower it, or we can sort of increase it if necessary, when it is necessary. And compared to the United States, they are now actually raising the interest, and we're lagging behind them. And actually, maybe in the near future, or at least in the future, sort of the most visible future, we may be able to revert to this sort of breach over the last period. So if you have a look at the securities, you can see the level of yield. And yes, you can see in the States it's a higher, and one thinks that this reflects the actual risk gap. But if we think about the risks that are embedded in Israel's economy, then people think that the risk there in the United States seem to be higher by what we can see. Now, the currency exchange rates for a long period of time, we saw a deflation, but we've seen that over the last year, at least from the point of view of the whole basket of currency, that we've seen that this has stopped with various fluctuations of the euro and the dollar, and of course that we have no control over. So we're looking at the basket as it is. So even if we're talking in realistic terms, you can see some kind of slight sort of minimal improvement. Now, what are the challenges that we face after we analyze the source of our resilience and the good performance of our economy? This is the growth in the GDP as compared to the United States and the European bloc and the world. Usually the blue line is above the entire world itself, but the question is whether this is sufficiently good. And here is the answer. When we compare the level, the standard of GDP as compared to the Aharon Institute of Israel's economy findings, it's at the IDC, we found that after this increase, because of less positive performance, we see a kind of sort of deterioration. But here you can see that our gap is growing, but it isn't sufficient. in order to improve the quality of life in Israel and to really be part of those countries that we would like to be similar to. We have a real issue of productivity in our economy. The product per hour is $27 less than in those countries in the European bloc that we would like to be similar to. That is a severe, grave problem. This productivity, you can see in the other countries, is actually improving, but with us, completely stagnant. It is not moving. More so than in 2009, the gap between us and them has unfortunately grown. So the productivity problem is truly a severe problem. And if there is no improvement, and if the growth is not led by this improvement in the productivity, we won't be able to improve our quality of living. Now, what are the reasons for this gap in the productivity? I'd like to quote various research studies that here we carried out at the Aaron Institute and in other places. 60% of the employment in Israel is in the service sector, which is a sector that does not take advantage of technologies. It doesn't use it, basically. But in order to improve this productivity, then we need to improve the productivity in that sector of services. It isn't sufficient if you just improve it in the high-tech sector. That does not lead it as an engine. So we need the elite technologies to permeate the service sector. There's a situation wherein we are historically lagging behind in capital per worker. You cannot compare that to the European workers, especially in the economy, infrastructure, and, for example, the transport. We have to increase the investment in this infrastructure, at least by 1 or 2% compared to the GDP, and have a look, historically speaking, at the actual government investment in this. Here, this is investment in infrastructure versus the GDP, and we actually invested 5 or 6% of the GDP in these basic infrastructure. Unfortunately, this has really reached the lowest possible levels in the 90s when the immigrants arrived from Russia. There was an improvement. At the moment, we find ourselves at the lowest point possible. So without a growth in that investment in the infrastructure, the basic economy infrastructure, we won't be able to improve the productivity. Now, very low personal capital. Very few of those who are joining the labor force, who raise the levels of employment, arrive without the appropriate skills in modern economy. They don't have the actual sufficient training. I'm talking about the Haredi population and the Muslim women who increase the levels of participation in the labor market. We must adopt reforms of training the human resources, training the actual human capital. And in Aharon Institute here at the IDC, we have recommendations, but I won't expand on them here. In addition to that, we know it's very difficult to run businesses and to do business with the State of Israel. We're very low if we're talking about the Doing Business Index with the World Bank. And if we do carry out reforms to improve and remove some of that red tape and bureaucracy and make things a little easier, based on the recommendations, all you need to do is implement the recommendations of the World Bank, because otherwise we won't be able to improve the productivity. In other words, we have recognized the problem, we've identified it, plus the recommendations, but we need to implement them. In addition to that, that is connected to poverty and inequality, that based on the various cutbacks in the budget, the effectivity of the welfare policy have also detrimentally affected people. So this, if you look after this progressive tax and fiscal policy has changed, and even there have been the transfer monies, but somehow we corroded this effectivity of it. In other words, you've got a bit of light, but unfortunately there is darkness alongside it. Now, please note an additional phenomenon. Over time, the actual consumption levels of the budget, the government budget, has been corroded. That's the blue line. But the social expenditure, education, health, and additional things in the government budget compared to the product have sort of been cut back. And alongside that, the private consumption, which is the red line, has grown from about 51 or 52% to 56%. I have identified these trends as some kind of attempt of the public that there's a tremendous demand of education, for health services. So they seem to be supplying themselves with what they should have been receiving from the government. They're doing so privately. So this is not only a Gini inequality, because those who can supply that for themselves independently, of course, does so, and those who cannot afford it are left without. Now, before I conclude, we've seen recently a decrease in the prices of housing, which is first class, but at the same time, we've also seen a dramatic decrease in construction beginnings. Now there is less than 14,000 beginnings of construction based on what the Bureau of Statistics has stated. So the starts of this construction has really deteriorated. The demand has perhaps decreased. We can't quite explain why, but in parallel, the supply has decreased, which in itself embeds in that a sort of renewed rise in price, because without these construction starts, unfortunately, things will not improve. So to summarize and wrap up, I haven't gone over my time, though it is of the essence. Now, macroeconomically, we have resilience, but it is not sufficient to bridge the gaps with those that exist between us and the countries in the OECD that we would like to be similar to. Without the actual improvement in the productivity, closing that productivity gap, there is a risk that standard of living in Israel will not be able to increase. And also a great part of the actual product over the last few years emanated from the increase in employment, which was very positive. It created product without productivity. And this process has basically, unfortunately, been exhausted, I believe. I don't actually predict an enormous increase in the actual involvement, actual joining of the labor market, because without productivity, we won't be able to continue growing. So this trickle-down permeation sort of process to poverty, etc., thinking about the macro improvement will bring about with it as a direct derivative an improvement in poverty may happen, but not sufficiently. We won't be able to solve the poverty and inequality in Israel's economy without this happening. So the quality and the quantity of provision of services and the bureaucratic processes in the state of Israel, unfortunately, truly need to be improved. Because without that improvement, we really will see ourselves facing tremendous challenges. And then this decrease in the construction starts could create an opposite trend of what we wanted to see, of a decrease in the prices of housing. On the contrary, they'll go up.